Hello YouTube, this is SammyD from SammyD Creates, coming at you today with a tutorial on Sketchup. This is a take from how I personally use Sketchup and some of the features that I find useful and some of the techniques that I apply when creating my drawings for different projects. So I hope you find this very educational and informative. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to kind of go over is some of the different icons that you will see within the Sketchup tool. So the first one being the pointer icon, and this is used to select items that you want to interact with. I tend to reference this as kind of the default element. I find it helpful that when transitioning from piece to piece, sometimes SketchUp doesn't release things very well. So, and then being able to, click off screen, or in some cases hitting the escape key is very helpful. The second one is the eraser. You use this to erase lines or objects that you have on the screen that you no longer want. So for instance, this image of this person, I can highlight it and then click and drag over it and it will erase it. So I tend to use this to erase the cutoff lines, or sometimes I'll overdraw a line to go across an intersection point. So that way I have a nice snap position, and I'll go over that in a little bit. So I use the eraser tool to cut off those extra bits. Fill tool, this is used when you're painting or highlighting various components. Sometimes this can be helpful when I have a large diagram or large design where I want to color different pieces just to show contrast and comparisons between items. The pencil tool, this is going to be one of your most common tools that you use. Obviously, this is a 3D drawing application, so you want to be able to draw. So I typically use the pencil icon versus the freeform squiggle or freehand, just because I like snapping to grids, and most of the stuff that I create tends to be of a very sharp edges and very fixed shapes. But the freehand mode can be helpful, especially when you have curves or you want something to just be purely freeform. There's no set pattern, or it's not hard lines or edges. The angle tool is helpful when you want to draw radii or radius components. This I use from time to time, especially when I want to do some sort of round over effect on a piece, or if I want to create some sort of bevel and such. The next one is the shape tool. The shape tool can be useful. I typically draw most of my items freehand. Well, not freehand, but I draw each of the components manually. However, I do find for representing screw holes or any kind of countersink points that the circle tool becomes very, very helpful. The next item is the push pull. This is used I use this a lot to shorten lengths of objects. If I have a particular board or a panel and I want to resize it, what I'll do is I'll use the push pull against one of the faces in order to drag or stretch, or to contract the piece. The outer shell, I don't use this one very often, so I'm not probably going to talk about this very much, but I believe this is useful for selecting either the outside, inside, or specific parts of a shape. Like I said, I don't typically use this. The move tool, this is extremely useful, and this is one of the key components that I tend to go to a lot. Obviously, you want to be able to move your piece around. When I create a compiled component, I tend to draw small pieces independently and then I move them to fit into place. This allows me to take a 3D drawing and create an exploded view of it. You tend to see this a lot in diagrams or part comparisons or part lists for various machinery. This is extremely helpful. A lot of times I will take like a side panel, as I'll show when I go through the build. I'll take it, move it to the side, manipulate it, edit it, tweak it, and then move it back into position. This way I'm building the finished product and representing each component one part at a time. The next one is the measuring tool. This one is also a definite go-to. The primary tool that I use is this dimensions button, and I like this because you can select 2 reference points and it will give you the total distance between those points using whatever scale or a system, so metric versus standard or imperial. Tape measure is good too if you want to just identify, a pure distance. I don't think it saves to the screen like the dimensioning tool. So for most of my diagrams, I like having the dimensions represented on the piece, so that way I can constantly reference it. The text tool is kind of nice because you can do call outs and point to pieces. So if you have, say, you want to create a comprehensive parts list, or if there's very minute details that you want to highlight without having to constantly scroll in or show the detailed view, you can do a text call out to provide a place to represent that. I don't use the protractor very much, only because when I draw my circles and or arcs, I use the arc tool, and that tends to allow me to see the angle that I'm drawing. The last one is the orbit tool. I don't typically click on this one very often. When you hold the middle mouse button and rotate, it allows you to default to the orbit view anyways, so I don't find it useful to actually click on it. You can use the scroll wheel to scroll in and out of the piece, and then wherever the mouse pointer is pointing out, when you scroll in, it will actually shift and move the camera in that direction. So when I want to move around on a piece, what I'll do is I'll point in the area that I want to zoom in on. I'll scroll into that area, then in another position on the screen, I'll actually point and scroll out. And by doing this, I can kind of inch my way or wiggle my way across a piece, doing various zoom in and zoom out methodologies in order to do it. The tool itself doesn't allow you to move around on the screen as intuitively as you would think. The movement icons are moving pieces around, not the camera. So by doing different techniques with zooming in and zooming out, I find that I can actually move around much quicker. That, in conjunction with the rotation tool, allows me to move around a piece, zoom in, rotate it a little bit, zoom back out, and then move around a piece very quickly. The orbit tool is also very handy because sometimes when you have a 3D object, you want to be able to see what it looks like from different angles. So if, say, you're joining various components to create a box, you want to make sure that your different sides line up properly, and sometimes there are minute gaps where you might need to tweak the size of an object or a plane in order to cover that gap. So I find the orbit tool is extremely helpful in stuff like that. So those are the primary icons and components that I tend to use for my different drawings. So hopefully, like I said, you find this useful and helpful. Let's go ahead and get started on creating a first piece. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and select the pencil icon, and I'll zoom into a component. So you'll see everything, because it's a 3D space, is represented along the 3 axes. So you have the blue axis, which typically runs up and down. Your green axis, which is your depth, typically runs front to back. And then your red axis typically runs from left to right or right to left. So that's how I tend to try to use this. So if you, depending upon how you want to do it, if you want to, say, move to where your red axis is your depth and your green is your left right or whatever, you have that freedom to change it. But I like to use just the standard view where blue is up down, red is left right, and then green is front to back. Like I said, it doesn't really matter which ones you use, as long as you mentally know that each of those colors represent that facing, and it applies universally for your design or drawing. So let's go ahead and just create a simple rectangle. So you'll see when you're drawing, if the line is black, that means that you're at a custom angle. But you'll see that in some cases, the line will change color based on the axis that you're moving along. So if I draw using this blue axis, then what will happen is the piece will be up down. If I draw along the green axis, such as here, it's going to represent front to back. And then obviously if I draw along the red axis, it's going to represent left or right in my particular case respectively. So knowing how the different lines apply, you can create various shapes very quickly and easily. And you'll notice that when you're drawing along an axis, if you have a parallel line that it meets it, when you hit the specific length of the parallel line, you'll see, such as in this case, this hashed or dotted blue line. This shows that there is an intersection point between those two pieces. So I find this extremely helpful. In addition, down in the bottom corner, you'll see a length box, and that will tell you how long your line is along that particular axis. So in this case, I'm going along the green axis. So if I click on here, then I can come back down. So let's go ahead and just create this box real quick. Now there are a variety of different ways that you can create these types of lines. So in this case, you'll see this is kind of tricky because it wants to snap to the first, the closer end point. But what would happen is if I did that, it would actually cross the piece and it wouldn't form a proper rectangle. So while I'm still on the red axis, sometimes you can kind of trick it into selecting the correct one. Obviously you can rotate the piece in order to identify the correct point. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and drag and draw along over, you know, the end point of where I believe it should be. Then I'll just rotate the piece, hit escape to break the line waypoints, then select this corner down here, and then I can come up here to the edge, or in some cases I'll draw over it. And as I mentioned before, using the eraser tool, I can now chop off these extra bits. So I find it in some cases easier to go ahead and just overdraw a particular line, knowing that I can come at it from a different angle and intersect with it. And this way it ensures that I have my proper, you know, dimensions and setup. So let's go ahead and finish drawing this. Now what you'll notice is that as you draw each piece, because it's a 3D tool, when the lines form the plane, then it will change the highlighting. So as you'll see, it changed it to various colors of blue. So if I want to select this particular side, if you hit delete, it's the same as hitting the eraser icon. You'll see it's now a box where you can actually see inside it. So the color shading helps with identifying the visual representation of the planes, so that way you can see them and understand the depth perception or depth perspective of them correctly. So let's just Control Z. So as with most Windows-based or products, Control C, Control Z, Control V, these are your general hotkeys that apply to copy, paste, and cut. So if you highlight a piece and you hit Control C, that will create a copy of it. If you hit Control V, that will paste a version of what you just copied. If you hit Control X, what that does is that actually does a cut, which creates a copy and then deletes the piece or cuts it out of your scene. So if you hit Control V, you can then paste it back in. So understanding those basic hotkeys to me is very important and will be, you know, extremely helpful when you're trying to manipulate your design. And then obviously, if you have an item selected, hit delete. In this case, it deleted the plane, but it didn't delete the lines. So the way that this 3D tool works is each line and plane is a different component or a different item in a group of a potential group of items. So if I highlight everything, you'll see the lines and the plane itself turn into a blue pattern. And that shows that I have all of those parts selected, versus if I just select the plane itself, only that is selected, but the lines are not. You can hit shift and click on each component independently, and as you click on them, they'll turn into this blue color, and that allows you to know that those particular items are selected. So now we have a box that represents our object. So what I want to do is I kind of want to just shrink this down in order to have it represent a piece of plywood. So what I like to do is select each of the different sides, create some reference dimensional lines. So this way, as I resize the different faces, I have an easy reference in order to see what is the represented size. Now I can use the measurement box down on the bottom corner, but in my case I use a widescreen monitor, and looking down there constantly is a little bit of a pain. So by just drawing these reference lines across the major angles, I'm able to easily identify, what is the size of that particular item. So I'll show you here as I shrink this down. So let's move this down to where it is 3/4 inch depth and 8 foot by 4 foot. So this represents a good size sheet of plywood. So I'll just zoom in. So when as I mentioned before, zooming around an object and having something on the screen certainly makes it easier. So if I want to look at this corner, I zoom in on this corner. I may zoom out on this side, and this allows me to move across the piece, right? So understanding the camera and how you can manipulate the camera is extremely helpful. So if I click on an object and I rotate, it rotates around that object. If I click on the background and rotate, it tends to rotate the background and not necessarily the fixed point. It's a little tricky. Sometimes the tool snaps to the object in view, sometimes it doesn't. So playing around with it and just becoming familiar with it obviously will help. If I want to change the surface based on this depth, what I'm going to do is select the plane that best intersects with that. So in this case, the front face, because I want to make this 3/4 of an inch thick, I will move it forward and back so that way it's expands and contracts kind of like an accordion along that surface. So now that I have my thickness dialed in at 3/4, what I'll do is then rotate a little bit in order to adjust the height. So since I want to adjust the height, I'm going to select this top surface, and that allows me to move it up and down. So let's resize this to 4 feet. And sometimes I find when you want to do minute changes, scrolling in makes it easier, because then you're moving less. Small movements have to travel further to make it larger. So finer details are much easier when you're zoomed in. As you can see, moving it around using these dimensional lines tends to make it very easy. So if we want to change the width now along this axis, we're going to drag it on this facing front and then drop it. So now we have a sheet of 8 foot by 4 foot with 3/4 inch depth piece of plywood. As I mentioned, a lot of the pieces that I work with start off in this fashion, right? So whatever dimensionally sized lumber you want to use, so if you want to change this to 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, it doesn't really much matter. You just size it accordingly. So this way it now represents a full sheet. So what I like to do when working with 3-dimensional items is when I have the part set to the specific size, I like to highlight it, right click, and say make group. And the reason I do that is it because each line is represented as an individual component or an individual part of this whole. By making it a group, kind of locks everything together. So now if I go and try to move this along one of the axes, it moves the whole thing. Otherwise, what might happen is if you try to move one of these lines, it's going to try to move, you know, that component, and then like here you might skew your diagram because I'm only selecting part of the selection. Like I said, I always try to work with items as a group, so that way it's a solid object versus a collection of different points. So let's go ahead and make a copy of this. So I'm going to highlight it, hit Control C and then Control V and create a copy. So I'm going to move that one off here to the side. So the next thing I want to do is, since I now have a sheet, I want to rotate it. By rotating it, I can change it to a different plane or a different, make a different surface on it. So if I want to rotate this to where the sheet is laying flat on the ground, what I'll do is I'll select the side that is perpendicular to the plane I want to rotate, click a point on it, click a second point to make sure you highlight the correct piece. So we'll select this, then the rotate tool, and then now I can rotate this along this axis, and it's nice because it gives you this protractor so you can see the different angles. So once again, I like, in this case we're working with a box, so everything is going to be 90 degrees to, you know, its respective angles. So it just kind of makes it really easy. So I can snap it across like this, and then now I have a piece that would be flat. So this could represent a surface such as the tabletop or cabinet top. Depending upon which surface you highlight, it will flip along that particular angle. So now what I want to do is I want to kind of shrink this down for the particular piece that I'm looking to create. So I want to create a cabinet that's going to be part of a miter workbench that I'm currently designing. As such, the cabinet obviously is pretty much a box, right? There's two sides, a back and a bottom facing. I'm not going to apply the top facing simply because that's going to be a much larger piece, and I want to stack multiple cabinets next to each other. So what I want to do is take one of my surfaces here. I'm planning to make all of the sides of it out of the same 3/4 inch sheet of plywood. What I want to do is just resize this component. So this is already exploded. So if you notice, when you highlight something, all of the sides are turned to the blue shade. And when you make it a group, when you click on it, all of the sides are highlighted. So it shows you all of the components that are included within that group. If you right click on it and say explode, you'll see that now you can select each side and each piece independently. The fact that it's not highlighted blue gives me an indication that this is definitely not a group of items. Since we want to resize this, what I want to do is make this 3 foot 1.5 inches wide, resize this half wide, and I'll remove my camera over, and then I want it to be 3 foot deep. So we'll just take this plane and resize it to 3 feet. So this represents the base of the cabinet. So let me do this. Once again, highlight it, make it a group so it locks all the surfaces together, and now I have something I can work with. So let me go ahead and take a copy of this and paste another one in next to it. Now, you'll see this is, because it's a 3-dimensional environment, this got placed farther back. So if I want to move this, what I can do is, since this is a collection, I can click on it and you'll see there's these little catch points on the different corners and such. What I can do is I can click on one of these endpoints and then I can snap it to whatever point on a different piece that I want to. So if I wanted it to snap this particular edge at the top, I can click on the top part of it. If I clicked on the bottom part of it, I can make a snap to the bottom. Do this a lot in order to, line up pieces so that way I can kind of see and get an idea visually of the sizes in comparison to each other. Do they look about correct? Obviously, the dimensional lines give me exact measurements, but sometimes it's good when you're working with a piece to be able to just eyeball it and manipulate things quickly. So I'm just going to snap this here as the other piece, and then once it's snapped, I can click on it. And if you drag something along the different access points, you'll see if I go along the blue, it moves it up and down. Red, it snaps it right to left, and green front to back. Now I know that if I move this along this red plane, that it's parallel to this, but it's off to the side so I can work with it. So let's move over here, and we want to rotate this. So that way it will be represented of the side of the piece. And then now let's take, so I'll click the corner here, and I'm gonna just snap it to the edge here. So you can see by doing that, I now have the side piece for this particular cabinet. Go ahead and create a copy of that, create a paste, and then I can move it over here. Now, if I snap it here, what's gonna happen is because it's along the top edge, it's actually not going to line up at the same height, obviously, because now it's 3/4 of an inch pushed up, right? So what I can do is zoom in here, click this corner that represents the corner that I want to join on, and then I can snap it and drag it down here. And this way I can move the item around very quickly and very rapidly. So now I have 2 walls. So what I want to do, because I know that this piece is the exact width that I want in relation to, and I want to create a backing for this. So what I'll do is I'll just create a copy of this, and then I will move it over to the side, camera around, and then let's rotate this so that way I can put it on the back. I want the dimensional lines to be in the front, so let me just rotate it the right way. And then what I'll do is click on the move tool, snap on the front corner here. I'm going to push it up here. Now, I know that there's this gap in the back because I didn't lock it on the inner corner, but I moved it over here just so that I can kind of get it in the general vicinity of what I want to do, and then that way I can have much finer control. So I actually want this back corner because the back corner will line up there. Snap it in. Oops. And now my backing is there. Because the bottom is not the same depth as the height, obviously there's this little bit of a gap. So let's go ahead and select this once again. Move it. So I'm going to move it along the green axis because I know the green axis is my depth. So front to back, move it off to the side, and then this way I can resize it. So there's a couple things I can do in order to identify how tall this has to be in relation to filling in this back plane. So I know that all my pieces are 3/4 of an inch tall, so I could just take 3 foot 1.5 inches and subtract 3/4 from it. Another thing I could do is, once again, using my dimensional lines, I can go over here, select the inner top corner, and then the bottom corner here, and it'll tell me that this exact height is 3 foot 3/4 of an inch. So, depending upon what you feel most comfortable with, some people are very quick at size conversions. I'm not one of those people. So sometimes it's nice to just kind of double check your work and just, select points in order to get exact measurements. Whatever works for you, that's what you should do. So let me highlight this. Now I can use the eraser tool. Now if I click and hold the button, anything that I highlight will get erased. And so I don't want to highlight that object. I just want to highlight the dimension lines and delete that. So now that I know this should be 3 3/4 3 foot 3/4 of an inch, what I can do is come over here, take my piece, right click, explode it, because I like, dealing with grouped objects. Explode it, position it so I can see this dimensional line which represents the side that I want to manipulate. Use my push tool, click on the top surface, and then I want to drag it up 3/4. There. Click my pointer, create a box around it, right click, make it a group, and now it's an object again. So now if I want to move this back, I select the corner that's my reference point, the corner that I want to join it to, and voila, I now have a perfectly fitting panel. So you can see that understanding the different tools and how this works can make your job designing very, very easy. Now, obviously, this is a box. It's very straightforward, very simple. Anything that's more intricate, more detailed will obviously be a little bit trickier. I highly recommend creating groups, in order to create components. You can take multiple items, like say I want all of these together. I can highlight them and I can make them a group as well. So now this is a solid object. I can move it around. I can create copies, etc. For finer detail items, it's probably very beneficial for you to go about creating smaller components or smaller items, then connecting those together, then creating those as a group of small components and building something that way. So this way you have all the control you need of the fine details, as well as you're assembling or constructing your item, kind of like stacking Lego brick. Whatever you feel most comfortable with, that's the direction you should go with. So now that I have this basic box, a couple things I might want to do. Because I don't want the cabinet resting directly on the floor, what I might want to do is create some sort of toe kick or some sort of raised component in the front. For that, there's a couple options. I could create smaller pieces and kind of attach them to the bottom of this in order to create like a small frame, or I can take these side panels and the back panel and stretch them down the height of the toe kick and then do a cutout. So that's what we're going to do next. So let me take this piece, explode it so that way it goes back to the small components, and then I'm going to move the components out along the different axes, just so that way I can separate them. Now, because I'm moving them along the axes, if I continue to move them back along the axis, I could potentially line them up, but I like clicking on points and then joining them that way. It just seems to make it much easier. So what I want to do is I want to first determine what is the size of the toe kick that I want to create. So I'll come down here to the bottom corner, create a cutout that is 2 inches by 2 inches. So if I go from here and I come out exactly 2 inches, and I can see that because I can see the length down in the bottom corner, I can create a point. And then now I have this reference endpoint. I can go up 2 inches here, and then I can create a point back. Now this creates a little square. Then I can go along, using the different axis indicators. So in this case, red, go across, and then I come back out 2 inches here, and then down and snap to there. And then rotate it, go across the bottom and snap. So now I have a little square bottom that represents all my pieces. This board, or this side piece, is still in its grouped state. So when I click on it, you can see all of the edges are blue. Before I chop this out, let me explode it. That way I can highlight each piece. So anytime there's a solid line, the application's smart enough to know that this is now a sub part of this whole. So the lines create a cut point or a potential cut point. So if I take my eraser, click and highlight the different sides, I can now cut them all out. Now, because this is still 3D, this inner piece is hollow, right? So I want this to look solid, so I'm just going to create another endpoint, and that will automatically fill in these two planes, so this way it represents the pure 3 dimension. As part of that, I deleted my dimensional line that went along the long axis, so let me just redraw that. Now, I can move this in a variety of angles and directions. I like keeping the pieces to where it's, you know, on the board itself if possible. It just keeps it cleaner when you're trying to assemble all the pieces together. That way you don't have all these weird lines poking out all over the place. So let me also draw in reference points down here to show how large this is. So now I know this is a 2x2 cutout. In this case, I didn't want my overall height to change because I didn't want to create this as an extension, so I didn't stretch it. I just cut out the piece here. So what I will want to do then is when I put this piece back in, I'm now going to snap it to this bottom corner. This now becomes a raised platform. It's no longer sitting on the floor. Now, I can do this same thing on this other side, and that's perfectly fine. However, because this side panel and this side panel are in essence identical, what I can do is just click, highlight this one, delete it, and then create a copy of this other side. So since this is not grouped, I don't want to do anything with it yet. So let me take this piece, which is still grouped, and let me move it back to the side out of the way. And the reason is because when I draw my selection box, I don't want this piece to be included. What I want to do here, so like I said, is I just want to highlight this so that way I can group this together, and that way it creates this back as a solid object with the dimension lines included. And then this way I can then now reattach this, select the bottom corner, select the corner I want to join it to, and now it's reattached. And then this side I can do Control C, Control V, and it'll paste it back in. Move it over here, select the corner that I want to join it on. Sometimes it gets very picky. Oops, this bottom one. There we go. So now I will have a 2-inch recess at the bottom because I don't want this to be an open gap at the bottom. And if I put the back panel back on here, oops, draw this back in, because the back panel is the same as the correct height, should be. Oh, that's right. So the back panel is offset by 3/4 of an inch because previously this piece was on the bottom. So what I will need to do is resize this. So let me move this back out of the way. Then I can select it, explode it, so that way I can resize it along a particular axis. Get it to where I can see my dimension lines. I apologize if I am moving around very quickly on this. Select my push-pull. Yeah. So now this is the correct size. So let me highlight it, group it back together, find the points that I want to be able to join on, click on my movement tool, and snap them into place. So now, let's right, because this snaps on the inside. This is where having the items grouped together makes it very nice, because you can just move them around as needed. So as you can see here, these lines right here represent that solid piece. Now in reality, they're not going to go all the way to the back like this. So what I need to do is move this forward 3/4 of an inch, because that's the thickness of the back board. But then I'll also need to trim it by that same 3/4 of an inch, because now this piece is not as wide, or doesn't represent the full depth, because it has that minus 3/4 of an inch. So let's just take this, move it out of the area, so that way I have it off to the side, load it, so that way it's no longer grouped. Get it to where I can see my dimension line for the side that I want to resize. Collect the plane. So this is 3 feet depth currently, so I want to take 3/4 of an inch off. So I'll shrink it down to 2 foot 11 1/4 of an inch. Then I will move it to where I can highlight it. Make sure all my sides are there, regroup it, and then move it back into position. So I want this corner to join to this corner. And voila. Now it's no longer poking through on the back, and it's the correct size. So now what I need is this front piece here. So the easiest thing I can do is take and highlight the back panel, copy, paste, because I know the back panel is the correct width. I just need to adjust the height. So like we did with the last piece, click it, explode it. I want to shrink it down. Now I know that this piece here to here is exactly 2 inches, right? So we see that here. And since this is going to rest against this bottom, I only need the piece to be 2 inches high. So let's just shrink it down. Inches, highlight it, group it to make it a solid object, and then now I want to move this, select the front corner, move it closer to my piece, and connect it. And do a quick orbital rotation just to see if there are any gaps, make sure all the pieces, no lines are showing through. And now I have the bottom of my cabinet build. So once again, I'm not going to do the top piece on it because that's going to be a much larger piece, but now I have basically one part of my cabinet created. So in this case, what I want to do next is highlight it, make it a group, and then what I can do is Control C, paste, and then I can snap another one next to it. So you can see here now I can stack these up as many as I need depending upon how long I want my miter station to be. So in this case, each one of these for what I want will turn into a cabinet where I'll have drawers, or I may put some shelves in there, but each one is a modular component. So when I build it, I can build it very quickly and easily this way. The only caveat is in something like this where while it's more convenient to create them in this manner, this middle joining piece, you will end up potentially using more materials, because rather than having one wall, I now have two walls side to side. So in some cases, it might be more beneficial for you, depending upon your project, to not draw this middle line on one of them and join the two cabinets together. Or perhaps you would want the back piece to be a solid piece where this becomes the middle becomes an inserted component. There's a variety of different ways to do it. So in my case, I'm okay with it being as independent cabinets, so therefore I can draw them in this manner, and then this way I can construct each one of them independently. I don't have to worry about it, and then I can just join them together later with some simple screws. So whatever suits for your project, that obviously is what you want to do. So I hope you found this tutorial somewhat informative. Let me know if you have any ideas, tips, or tricks in the comments below. And thank you for joining me. Have a nice day.